So the Spanish were the first Europeans to discover the Western Hemisphere, and they first landed in the Caribbean here. Uh, the people that lived in what's now Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic were called the Tainos. So people that lived in this area, the Taino chiefs were called caciques and controlled the production and distribution of food. The elites were served by large numbers of servants who dressed their masters in feathers, woven clothes, and metal jewelry, including some gold. They even carried the uh, the caciques on litters. So this impressed the Spanish quite a bit, especially the gold that these people had acquired. The Spanish are very interested in where that came from. The So there was a nobility among the Taino people, and the Spanish thought they understood that. The commoners of the Tainos mostly farmed and fished. The people the Spanish would encounter somewhat later, other than these Caribbean peoples, were what's called the Mexica. So natives in what's called in your book Mesoamerica, which is this area of central Mexico and Central America. Natives first began to domesticate squash there around 10,000 years ago, and they were the most settled people of the Americas. By 1500 BCE, or before current era, farming villages began to give way to more advanced cultures that produced urbanized sites. Um, the Olmecs were the first to build cities, plazas, and pyramids. So the Olmecs built these ceremonial heads that you can find in Central America. That civilization lasted several hundred years, but went out sometime in the first millennium. A nearby civilization that we don't know too much about 30 miles from present-day Mexico City, stands a site called Teotihuacan, which you can see here. By 650 CE, or current era, the city was 15 square miles and housed about 200,000 people. It was the sixth largest city of its time. The Olmecs and whoever lived in Teotihuacan, we think maybe the Toltecs, we're not sure, but whoever lived in those places died out by the end of the first millennium CE, or those civilizations had given way. The next powerful civilization were the Mayans. The Maya were centered in the Yucatan Peninsula and built cities with palaces, aqueducts, pyramids, and even observatories. They had a written language and a concept of the mathematical zero, which is a much more sophisticated mathematical concept than we give it credit for. Between 300 and 900 CE, or current era, the Mayans had about 50 cities spread across Central America. Nevertheless, the Mayans also declined. Why, we're not really sure. By the 1300s, or equivalent in Europe, the medieval period, the Aztecs, or what became the Aztec Empire, it had consolidated much of the area that the old Olmec and Mayan empires had once controlled. The Aztecs originally came from an area further north in what's now northern Mexico. They were very focused on warfare, and they built a city not far from the old Teotihuacan site, which was called Tenochtitlan. Excuse me. Tenochtitlan was built on an island in a lake called Lake Texcoco. Lake Texcoco, which it probably looked something like this, was connected to the mainland by three causeways. This city housed more than 250,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. And it had wide roads, huge temple. It had botanical gardens, and it had vast trading markets that held tribute goods from the millions of people that the Aztecs either controlled or dominated. Ironically, the Aztec civilization was the most similar to European civilization as anything you'd find in the Americas. So it's kind of ironic that the Spanish came and so decimated, or more than decimated, so destroyed the Aztec Empire, since the Aztecs had uh, a very clear and small aristocracy. That aristocracy was all male. They dominated the religion, the military, and the politics of the empire. The commoners all performed the manual labor. So the Aztecs worshipped a god called Huitzli-Pochtli, and warriors were among the most exalted of Aztec citizens. Warriors were necessary to control the vast empire that uh, the Aztecs had conquered. So the empire as a whole contained somewhere around 25 million people. And the Aztecs considered the capture of prisoners to be the ultimate act of bravery. Prisoners that the Aztec warriors would capture were usually turned over to the priest class, and the priests would sacrifice these prisoners to the war god, Huitzli-Pochtli. And the way they would be sacrificed was by cutting out the hearts of these people. If you've ever seen the movie Apocalypto, it actually quite accurately visualizes that sacrificial process. The Aztecs believed that they did not engage in kind of these continual sacrifices to the war god, that he would become angry and his hunger for blood would not be assuaged, and the sun would grow larger and burn up the world, and eventually the sun would burn out and cause everlasting darkness. So the Aztecs had a very powerful civilization, and it was quite dramatically illustrated by this system of capturing people throughout the empire and then sacrificing them. Tribute flowed in from the empire, sent in the form of goods, not really money. Goods were redistributed to the Aztec citizens, so if you were part of the Aztec citizenry, things were pretty good for you in and around Tenochtitlan. Tribute included victims for sacrifice, but also included things like corn, beans, and luxury goods like turquoise, gold, and feathers. The small nobility of warriors were supported by an even smaller priesthood who commanded the obedience of everyone. Generally speaking, the Aztecs would leave a ruling elite intact in their various provinces as long as they paid tribute to the Aztec Empire. And so, as long as outlying peoples in the Aztec Empire paid tribute in the form of goods and sacrificial people, the Aztecs would not attack them. So, this will be a discussion question. What do you think was the result of that? How do you think the subjects would feel? And you'll want to take a look at this image for a few minutes. So at this point, you can pause the pause the video and take a look at this image, and then part of the discussion question will ask you, how do you think that the tributary peoples, the people the Aztecs controlled, would feel about this kind of action taking place? Okay, so North America on the eve of contact was a fascinating place, a very diverse place. By the end of the 15th century, the people of North America numbered between 5 and 10 million. while the Western Hemisphere as a whole numbered anywhere from 50 to 120 million. These millions of people lived in thousands of different ways. Some were matrilineal, others were patrilineal, some hunted, farmed, fished, gathered, or some combination of all of those. Some were egalitarian, while others had stratified societies with nobility and commoners. Some of these had powerful chiefs, others had councils of elders, some had religions focused on animals, others on nature. Some of these people, like the Mexica, had deep histories and sophisticated life ways. So, generally speaking, these were full and vibrant civilizations living in the Americas prior to contact, and they developed to varying levels of sophistication based on the context of their environment and cultures. So, it's too bad we don't know more about these people, but it's important to remember that these were dynamic and very complicated civilizations, and most of the information about them has been lost. So, next we'll look at what was going on in Europe around the time of discovery and the Europeans' first discoveries of the Western Hemisphere.